Hello, my friends, and welcome to Mindvalley Book Club interview. I'm Christina Mandlakiani, co-founder of Mindvalley, as usual, and I have a very wonderful guest for you today. I think I like to say that my guests are wonderful, but I truly find my guests wonderful. So I'll give you an introduction. I'll give my guest an introduction, and then we'll start the conversation about a book which I personally found very interesting. So my guest today is Dr. Megan Anna Neff. Hi.
Hello.
Welcome to Mindvalley Book Club. And so Dr. Neff is actually autistic ADHD psychotherapist, practicing psychotherapist. And she is also a co-founder of, I have to actually look it up, of Neurodivergent Insight, founder of Neurodivergent Insight. And I know you have a podcast where you're actually educating adult population about autism and, well, other neurodivergent cases, if that's correct to say. Do add if I have missed out anything of importance out of this introduction.
I think you got it. Yes, I co-host Divergent Conversations with another autistic ADHD mental health provider as well. So, yep, you've got
Thank
it.
you. Thank you so much. And we are talking today about Dr. Neff's latest book, which is Self-Care for Autistic People. And it offers actually 100 different techniques and practices for people to take care of themselves, actually for autistic people, not just for any people. And welcome, everyone. Actually, I started with an introduction and I forgot to ask the usual question. Do you guys hear me, and where are you right now listening to us from? So thank you guys for doing that on autopilot without me prompting. That means we have our little rituals. And welcome to everyone from Sweden, from California, Estonia, Brazil. Wow, I love our geography. So back to the book and back to my guest and back to Dr. Neff. So I guess I'll ask the first question. So where are you connecting to us from right now?
I'm in Portland, Oregon, in the United States.
So it
So
must be,
I'm opposite you. I'm just starting my day.
oh my, it must be almost like 12 hours difference, I'm
I
afraid.
think I think so. It's 8 a.m.
Wow, wow, that's really early. So thank you for joining me and actually our audience as well so early. And I want to probably start with a little bit of a background because you got your diagnosis, although we don't talk about autism as a disease, but you got your diagnosis later in your life. Uh, is it okay for you to share what prompted you to actually probe into that? And maybe another question would be why later in your life, why wasn't it detected earlier?
Yeah, absolutely. Both are fantastic questions and very comfortable talking about them. Yeah, and there's this idea of the lost generation of autistic adults, and also we could talk about the lost generation of ADHD adults. So this is actually a pretty common experience, especially for adults in their 30s, 40s, and older. And partly because I was growing up as a kid in the 80s and 90s, and the diagnostic criteria looked a bit different. Our understanding of autism, especially our understanding of autism in girls, looked really different. But for my personal reason, and this is becoming a really common story, it's kind of like the child to parent pipeline. It was after one of my children was identified as autistic, and here I had just finished my doctorate in psychology, and I was a bit surprised that she was autistic because all of the stereotypes and kind of ideas I had in mind of what autism looked like, she wasn't matching that. Um, and so I started a deep dive into autism in girls specifically. And I was like, wait, this is all feeling very familiar, especially as I debunked some of the myths that I had in mind. And so, and one of the things I learned is that autism is very hereditary. So it's very common when a child is identified for one of the parents to at least be on the broader autistic phenotype. Um, so that's what got me looking into it. But really, within a week of deep diving into the research of autism, I simply knew I was autistic. At that point, I'd been in depth psychotherapy, so psychoanalytic psychotherapy for about 4 years. I was doing that because as part of my training to become a psychologist. I felt like doing that kind of depth work was really good. And there were a lot of themes that we were exploring around how I experienced the world, how I experienced my body, how I kind of this struggle to stay continually in relationships. So there are a lot of themes I was exploring that just made sense once I had this autistic lens. So that is why I personally pursued it. And then if you'd like, I could say a little bit more about why I
Yeah.
think so many are not diagnosed.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think partly, so the diagnostic criteria has evolved and shaped a lot in the last 30, 40, even 20 years. Autism is still relatively new when we think about the scientific, history of it. In the early 1900s, it was conceptualized as childhood schizophrenia. And it wasn't really until the 1950s and 60s and that we really started seeing autism as this distinct condition. And even then, it was really what we would I don't like the language of severe, but it was kind of it was thought to be very rare, and it was those with a lot of support needs that were being identified.
Mhm.
And that over time, that like the diagnostic criteria has evolved, but really only in the last, I would say 10, 15 years have we started looking at the idea of autistic girls. For a long time, there was this idea that, oh, autism is a boy's condition. And there's so much wrong with that on many levels that we could get into if you want to. But partly we just didn't understand what autism, how it can look in females and in genderqueer people, also in BIPOC people. Like, so we just had a really narrow understanding basically of what autism looks like in kind of white, cis, straight boys. Um, and so a lot of people were being missed partly because of that.
Thank you for that explanation. I am noticing with the side of my eye that there is conversation going on in the chat. I'm really happy about that. If you have a question, my dear friends, to my guests, then please leave them in Q&A because I will be able to bring them up by the end of the interview. Meanwhile, I want to ask you a question because I invited you guys to the interview with one. Well, when I was writing about this interview, I was mentioning that I believe nowadays practically every person has someone in their environment, maybe a close person or not so close person, who has gotten a diagnosis. If we're talking about autism, maybe a little less, but when it comes to ADHD, it becomes quite common. I can think of a dozen people at least who have been officially diagnosed. So the question that I have for my guests is, do write if you have someone in your life who has autism or maybe other neurodivergent diagnosis or condition is probably a better word. But for my guest, Dr. Neff, I want to ask a little bit maybe sensitive question. So since there's since the stigma around autism is starting to shatter and people are a little bit more open and tolerant of that idea, and also some well, high profile CEOs and super successful people have made ADHD and specifically Asperger's a matter of almost pride. What do you feel? And also, I know that because I've read some literature on autism, it's kind of easy to see certain traits in neurotypical people that, oh, I also feel like that, because it is a spectrum in the sense that it has a whole lot of different markers, which maybe not a sign of anything. So what do you feel if people are wondering, is it beneficial to actually go and seek a diagnosis? Is it okay if people just self-diagnose and then keep talking about that as if it's an accomplished fact? What is your take on that?
That is a big question. And I have some nuanced thoughts on it. So I think going back to this idea of the lost generation, there's a reason that so many adults are finding the framework of neurodivergence, ADHD, or autism specifically, and are attaching to it. And on one hand, there could be other reasons, right? Like if you're, watching a 90-second TikTok and someone's talking about it, like there could be other reasons that you resonate with that. Um, and so I do think it's good to be aware that someone might be sharing an experience that you resonate with, but for other reasons. So I think it's always good to have that in mind. That
Hmm.
said, my sense is that the large bulk of people who are self-identifying um, are doing a lot of research, especially autistic people. I mean, autistic people, we tend to love research. We tend to do a deep dive. So it's not, most autistic people are not self-diagnosing after watching a little bit. It's like they're watching and then they're going and they're reading and then they're and then they're taking the online screeners and then they're collecting data. And I think for a lot of folks, especially if they have a lifetime of mental health conditions that have not responded well to treatment, or a lifetime of confusion around relationships, they're getting access to a framework where they can finally understand themselves. And from that, they can finally attune to themselves. Their life makes sense. I know for me, I talked about how once I had this language and framework of autism, like I felt at peace in my body for the first time in my life. And it's not because my body is all of a sudden a magical, like easy place to live in. It's not. I still have like I'm still sensory overwhelmed all the time. I still have various struggles, but it made sense. Like my experience of my body made sense. Um, and so I think that this is happening for a lot of adults, especially because they often have had, again, kind of a litany of mental health conditions that haven't made sense. There's a lot of barriers to diagnosis, especially, and it will depend partly on the country, but especially in underserved communities. So again, BIPOC individuals, women, genderqueer folks. And so because of the barriers to assessment and diagnosis, I do tend to be a proponent of self-diagnosis. I think it should be done after a lot of consideration, after like collecting a lot of data points. Um, I think if someone has access to a really robust and affirming assessment, that's great because both autism and ADHD, neither of them tend to walk alone. They often do come with things like anxiety, depression, OCD, bipolar, PTSD. So if someone is able to get an assessment where they're really able to tease out like, yes, autism or yes, ADHD, and these other things that we can also be supporting and treating, I think that's the ideal. Unfortunately, I think we live in a world where that ideal is hard to access for many.
Hmm. So I see that there are questions coming in, and I'll get to them because there are actually more questions than normally coming in. So I'll look into them
It's a
earlier
big
than.
topic.
Yeah,
We've
it
hit
is.
on.
And I think it's not talked enough. There's sometimes not enough professional approach to that because it's good, echoing what you're saying, it's good if you suspect it, but it's still much better if you have a community which is educated to bounce it. Uh, I don't know the expression, but talk about it in that community. But I want to get back to that relating. When I was reading your book, I did relate to a lot of advice that you were giving, and also some struggles. Of course, we are human, and I guess anxiety and depression are not exclusively are not exclusive to any part of the human population. What I'm trying to ask is, what's the difference between self-care for autistic people and for neurotypical people? Like this book, I think it's applicable to. I do not know that I would be non-neurotypical. I think I'm neurotypical, but it would be applicable for me. So what makes it different, and how autistic people have different needs from the rest of the population?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've gotten that feedback from others who are allistic, non-autistic, and I always appreciate it. I'm glad that it expands beyond autistic people and helpfulness. I would say, well, I'd say a few things. I'd say the approach I took in the book is part of what makes it like an autistic book. For autistic people, I don't know what your child was like, but we ask why a lot. Like we need to understand the context. So if I were to go to a therapist and someone was just like, here's a deep breathing exercise, I'd be like, why am I going to do that? But if it's like, okay, here's your nervous system, here's the sympathetic nervous system, here's your autonomic nervous system, this is how you activate your vagal nerve and your like, and your relaxation response, then I'd be like, oh, okay. So I think part of it is needing to understand our bodies, and autistic people tend to have a distinct nervous system, a more sensitive nervous system that more easily flips into stress states. And with that, a more sensitive sensory system. So I think understanding specifically the uniqueness of our autistic system, but then starting self-care often with education of like, here's why it matters. Here's why I might choose to name the emotion I'm experiencing. Um, Again, not just throwing an intervention or a self-care practice at someone, but explaining here's why you might choose to do this. So lots of education, I think, is really foundational to self-care for autistic people. I think
Mm.
some other ways it can be a bit different. So I think all self-care for all people starts with self-attunement, the ability to attune to ourselves moment to moment of what is happening for me in this moment. What do I need in this moment? That's hard for autistic people for a variety of reasons. Um, and so I think kind of adapting how we self-attune to ourselves, learning skills to check in with ourselves that often don't look like or use the same language that an allistic person might use. I think that's a step. And
Mhm.
then if I was to make a self-care equation, it'd be self-attunement and then taking action to move toward what we need. And I think there's also some distinct barriers autistic people run into in that taking action step. So I think um, the validating of our experience is part of a lot of us have a lot of invalidation around our experiences. So, and when we do that, we tend to not take action on what we need. So I think both addressing the barriers to self-attunement and the barriers to taking action become really important when working with autistic self-care.
Mm.
That was a lot, and it was kind of all over the place.
No, no, I would actually add one more thing to that probably, because as I was reading, I did hear my son actually in that book. My son is the one who has Asperger's, and I did hear a little bit of him in the sense that it's very straightforward. The way you write, you're like, don't make long and winding detours. And I think the book definitely reads good for people who are autistic. But I would also say that it is interesting for everyone because it has some of the very important skills for our well-being in everyday life. Now, what I want to ask though is, if I get my thoughts together, I was reading this book, of course, I picked it I wouldn't, well, curiosity is natural, probably feeling, but I picked it up because I want to understand better how autistic people feel, how they function, what is their life experience. Partially because my teenage son is also with that diagnosis. Now, as an autistic person who has worked with a lot of other autistic adults, what are some of the myths which we people don't understand? And for people who don't know the terminology, allistic are those who are not autistic, not necessarily neurotypical, but not autistic. What are some of the myths which are damaging, which you would like very much the whole world to stop propagating and to understand once and for all?
First of all, I love that question. So I would say one of the most damaging myths is around our experience of emotion and empathy. This idea that autistic people can't have empathy, and this is still even out there among mental health professionals. Like you'll hear mental health professionals say, well, I don't think my client could be autistic because they have so much empathy. Um, the we might show empathy differently. We certainly tend to show our emotions differently, but just because it's not registering in the way allistic people expect it, doesn't mean it's not there. And especially with empathy, it's really interesting. So with autism in general, we tend to be on the extremes. Like with our sensory system, we can either be hypersensitive or hyposensitive, having a dulled experience. Similar with empathy, there are autistic people who have a dulled experience of empathy, specifically affective empathy, that emotion empathy. Um, but there's also a lot of autistic people who have hyper empathy. A lot of the folks I specifically work with have more of that experience of hyper empathy, where it is so painful to be in the room with people that are hurting, like needing to, like I am so careful about what media I take in because those painful stories will stay with me, and how deeply they encode. Um, a lot of people, I think, often don't even consider autism for themselves because they have hyper empathy, and they're like, oh, well, I can't be autistic because I have empathy. So I would say that is like a myth I would love to see debunked. Um, Another one that is out there, but people don't have the language for this, but it's out there, is the idea that autism and intellectual disability are always together. Those are two, like if you were going to someone for an assessment, those would be two different diagnoses. You'd diagnose an intellectual disability if that was there, and autism. And among the people identified as autistic, there is a higher percentage who also have an intellectual disability, but there are also autistic people who have high IQs, who have average IQs. So being autistic tells you nothing about a person's IQ. Um, and so I think that myth is still out there. And then, and this is the one that might surprise your listeners the most, but the idea that autism is a communication deficit. So there's some really interesting research coming out that shows it is a difference, in the same way that we might think about cross-cultural communication and different cultural norms. Dr. Damian Milton came up with this. I'm going to drink some tea. My throat is
Yeah.
struggling a little bit. Um, so Dr. Milton, who's a sociologist, an autistic sociologist, talks about the double empathy problem, this idea that it's really a two-way street. So in the same way that an autistic person, like I might struggle to understand what's happening in your mind, you also might struggle to understand what's happening in my mind. So it's a two-way disconnect, not just an autistic person struggling to understand another person's communication and norms. And they actually, there's been some empirical studies that have followed this up. So they've paired people either in autistic pairings, or autistic allistic. And in fact, this has been found across many studies that, autistic people, we connect quite well with each other. And so it's a communication difference. We have a distinct style of communicating. It's when we're communicating with allistic people that there tends to be more misunderstandings, more disconnects, but that often gets registered as, oh, that's a deficit in the autistic person, versus that's a difference, in the same way that we might have cross-cultural communication differences.
Thank you for this answer. Actually, I sometimes explain also to people about how my son's brain works. It's like, you have Mac and you have Dell or Microsoft, and they're just different operating systems. So
That's a good metaphor. Yeah. Yeah. Different systems.
I do want to ask a little bit sensitive question again, and then I'll get to the questions because there are so many questions about the rudeness thing, because this is another I do not know, is it an argument or not argument, another concern
Yeah. It's
people have
another
on both
misconception.
sides, but on both sides, by the way, because I've also heard people saying that I am rude only because, I'm autistic. So how would you be able to comment on that? Because I do believe it is not a genuine, like not rudeness in the essence, or maybe,
Yeah.
it's not an excuse for rudeness. I do not know.
I mean, both. I think it's both. So again, if we go back to thinking about it cross-culturally, I gave a talk recently where I had them play a game of like rude or polite, and how, so if someone comes up to me and it's like, um, how are you like they start doing small talk, or they want a hug, is that rude or polite? Well, most holistic people would be like, that person's being polite. I'd be like, you're being intrusive and you're being rude. Like what we experience as rudeness or politeness is also shaped by our neurology. So autistic communication tends to be very direct. We tend to be pretty literal. So if you ask me, like, do I look good in this dress? I'm assuming you actually want the fact that you want to know. I would miss that this is actually a social bid. You're asking to get a boost of confidence before you go out. If that's what you want, just tell me that's what you want. Like, hey, I'm feeling insecure. Can you tell me I look good? It's like, okay, then I will. But in my mind, I think that's actually very kind, to be honest. So yes, we do tend to be direct, and we tend to be, because we take things at face value, if you ask a question that's more, you're actually asking for a social bid, and we answer in the very factual, like straightforward way, that can often be experienced as rude. On the other hand, I think all humans, being in relationship with other humans, have some responsibility to learn about intent versus impact, and like the impact we have on others. So I think I've seen that out there before, where people are like, oh, well, I can't be racist because I'm autistic, or I can't be rude because I'm autistic. And being autistic isn't a, like, you don't get to have an out on considering how your actions impact others. I do think there's a lot more going on that needs to be considered, but I also have seen what you're talking about, where it's used, it's almost used as a way of like, well, I don't need to reflect more deeply about how my actions are impacting others. I hope all humans, no matter your neurotype, are thinking about how the impact that we have on other humans. So I do think that there are a lot of times that autistic actions get mislabeled as rude, and that's an unfair attribution. I also have, in rare cases, seen what you're talking about, where people might use it as an excuse to not be self-reflective.
Thank you for this answer. I actually think this is such an interesting topic to research deeper, but I have promised my guests to ask questions. So there is, interesting question. Sebastian, sorry. What makes autism special? I wonder if this question is enough. If Sebastian is here, maybe you can add some context to that.
I
Would you
think
know?
it's like, it's rare. I mean, by rare, I mean, so like 1 in 36 kids right now, that's the statistic. I think ADHD is 1 in 9. Those are state statistics. So it's,
Mhm.
you're a neurominority when you're autistic or ADHD. And so that means most of my interactions for most of my life until currently have been with allistic people. So I'm almost always in a cross neurotype interaction growing up. And so it's, I think neurominority might be a more helpful language than special. Yeah, that would be my thought.
Thank you for answering this puzzling question. There's another one from Carmen. Sorry, Carmen. I think I am on a row of mispronouncing names today. Autism is related. It's a question. Autism is related somehow to avoidant attachment style. It's a question. Is autism related to avoidant attachment style?
Oh my gosh. I have a whole podcast on this. So I identify, and I'm still thinking on this. I always have, as someone, I feel pretty secure, but I definitely lean more avoidant. And one thing that I've been unpacking, I don't think it's because it's my genuine attachment style. I think it's for sensory reasons. I think it's because my emotional or my social battery is a lot lower. So that's actually something, I don't know if it'd be helpful. I can share the link to there. We did an episode where we explored attachment style and neurodivergence. So there has been research that suggests that. I'm curious how much that's a genuine, this is my relational attachment system versus I look this way because I need a lot of alone time, because being in a room with 4 or 5 people on a sensory level is a lot. So yeah, that's something I'm very curious about as well.
So talking about that, I know that in your book you have a whole section about romantic relationships, and I have wondered about that. Well, being a mother of a son, how do autistic people navigate that highly intrusive aspect of life? Because when we are in a romantic relationship, we do allow people much closer into our space, both emotionally and physically. It's a little bit maybe too open question, but I do wonder what are there
Yeah.
any short
No, I
points?
can run with that. I can run because there's a lot there. So first of all, one thing, that there's a lot of overlap between autism and also ADHD and the LGBTQ community. And so that I just think is important to know. And then with that, like, there is a higher percentage of us who are asexual. However, I think that's another myth. Sometimes people are like, oh, autistic people can't be sexual. But it's really interesting. I think in the same way that our sensory systems can be all over the place. I see this show up specifically around physical intimacy, where sex can actually be a place of like sensory stimulus, sensory pleasure, a place of kind of shutting off the mind. So for some, it's a really powerful kind of safe sensory experience. There's also a lot of overlap with kink culture and autism. And I think if you think about kink culture, there's a lot of rules. And I mean that could be a whole conversation of why there might be overlap. Um, so and then polyamory is more common as well among autistic people. So it's really like you have this full gamut of some who might identify as ace, and then some um, who are into kink culture. Like you have a whole spectrum of how intimacy can show up for autistic people. I think in what might be a common theme is the need to think about it and communicate about it. I think communication becomes really important. I think this is why it is so important to know a person's sensory experience and then what a person's boundaries are. Um, so yeah, it's I think it is an interesting intersection, and that's probably one that's not talked about enough either.
And I was just about to ask, is there any research about, the chances of success for autistic people to connect romantically with, let's say, other autistic versus allistic people? And not that I care about the chances of success, but I mean, if you fall in love with someone, you probably don't ask about their background before you fall in love.
Yeah. Well, and we probably don't yet. I mean, there's so many autistic adults who aren't yet identified. So our research probably wouldn't, maybe in a generation or two we could have better research. It's interesting. I don't know of any studies on that specifically, but drawing on Dr. Compton's work that has looked at kind of the connection and rapport among autistic people versus when you're in a cross neurotype, I think it would make a lot of sense that in romantic partnerships, that kind of cohesion would also follow. The other thing I anecdotally see, I'll see a lot of autistic and ADHD couples pair up, which is always really interesting because in some ways they're very different, and in other ways there's a lot of overlap. But I think there's still connection around kind of divergent thinking, and there's some divergent communication that's similar. So that's actually an interesting pairing that I see a lot, is someone who's autistic and someone who's ADHD who end up partnering.
I'm afraid of having this conversation much longer because I think I have a few more book ideas for you. maybe you can write more books. I know that the one which we're discussing right now is not your first book. I've seen you have published books before. Back to the questions from the audience while we still have time. There is a question. Oh, very specific question from Arcana. What are the tests one can do to test autism and ADHD?
Yeah. So a few different answers here. If someone's in the process of self-discovery, I think listening to autistic ADHD people, listening to lived experience, and taking online screeners is a first step. And then there's tests that like a psychologist or a provider might give. In regards to in that first stage of kind of self-discovery, there's a fantastic website. It's called Embrace Autism, and they have several screeners, specifically autistic ones. I think they also have some ADHD ones. For ADHD, if you Google the ASRS5, there's also an online version of that. I also have links on my website to like 5 ADHD screeners and 6 autistic screeners. The CAT-Q is one that for autistic adults who think perhaps they would fall into that masking. That's a really helpful one because it actually measures how much you mask, and that's one of the newer screeners. So there's a lot that's out there that will give you. I encourage people to think of these as data points. Like, so if one is above threshold, it doesn't necessarily mean you're autistic or ADHD, but it is a really good data point as part of the kind of discovery process.
Would you mind telling me what's the website? I'll type it up into the
Yeah,
chat.
Embrace Autism is the one that has a lot of autism screeners. And
.com.
then .com, yeah. And
Uh,
then my website is neurodivergentinsights.com. I could, if it'd be helpful, I could pull up the links I have to the 5 screeners and put it in the chat. Would that be helpful?
Sure, yeah. We will share the links, of course, in the description to the video. And yes, please, or at least explain how to find them there, because I think a lot of people are curious to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'll give you time to do that. Meanwhile, there are more questions. So, oh, and Arcana says, thank you so much for that. I didn't spell them properly. Marsha is here to help. And the neurodivergentinsights.com blog, a review of ADHD screeners.
And then I just put the autism one.
Yeah.
And I can, is that the embrace autism? Okay, yeah. Okay, perfect.
That's awesome. And then there is an interesting question from Trudy. Can autistic traits vary day to day depending on the environment and what is going on in life? I find some days I can cope with life much better than others.
Absolutely. So one frame I've heard that I really like is that the DSM, the diagnostic criteria for autism, is autistic people in distress. So for example, difficulty with transitions, difficulty with routine changes. You know, if I'm in a season of my life where you know, my sensory system's pretty regulated, my nervous system's pretty regulated, which so much impacts that, right? Like life events, my diet, my movement, all of these things impact that. Then I'm going to be able to handle routine disruptions a little bit better. But when I'm like, we moved a year ago, so everything was in transition. During that time, like I relied a lot more on my safe foods, which for me is like a frozen vegetarian burrito. So I was like eating this like 3 times a day, and it was pretty much all I was eating. So my food restriction got a lot more intense because there was so much change happening in my life, or I would be stimming more because again, there's so much change happening in my life. So when an autistic person is in stress, our autistic traits will be more evident. Or if we're in a season of burnout, or if we're having like a mental health struggle with like depression or anxiety, again, these traits, which are really signals of distress for the most part, are going to be more apparent, or our ability to mask is going to go down.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. I am mindful of the time and there are questions coming in. Now people are active. So a question from Sheena. Is there always a genetic link with features often being presented in parents and kids?
Yeah, it's highly heritable. So it's common for like I was saying, that was one of the statistics I read that I was like, okay, I'm gonna go look into this, was it's common for one of the parents to be autistic when a child is. There are some instances where a child might be autistic due to birth complications. That has happened at times. And then, so I know of a few people where there was a birth complication, especially around like maybe oxygen wasn't what was cut off for a certain period of time, but there really is no autism in the family. So I don't like mentally, I don't know what to do with that, how to conceptualize that, but I know that happens as well. But I think what is much more common is that autistic people have autistic children. Yeah.
So I do want to ask, I hope you don't mind, a little bit in the more dangerous territory. I know you don't like talking about autism as spectrum and the functionality and everything, but do you think that we as a society should also understand the other side of the spectrum where the people are less functional, non-verbal, or people who cannot talk? And because I think this group of autistic people is completely excluded from conversation.
Yeah. So I am actually, I'm so glad you asked that question. This has been my concern. You know, I've been in this space for about 4 years. And when I started in this space, really it was understanding folks like me that was really missed, right? Like mental health providers didn't understand um, kind of masked autistic people. And so there needed to be some corrective of like autism isn't just this. But one worry I've had, and I've heard it called like TikTok advocacy or Instagram advocacy, is that in that shift of, because we absolutely need to be like, hey, we're here too. And partly because the suicide risks of autistic people, um, especially autistic people without intellectual disabilities, is incredibly high. So there's reasons we need to spotlight this group. But my fear is that in spotlighting on non-stereotypical presentations, and in centering that, especially in social media spaces, that we are decentering some of the autistic people who have the highest support needs. And I'm really worried about that trend. And so absolutely, the conversation needs to be expansive. It needs to be one that can both talk about how important it is to identify um, people without intellectual disabilities. People, there's level 1, 2, and 3. I don't love that language, but kind of level 1 autistic people, because they tend to have very high mental health support needs. But we need to be able to do that in a way that's not compromising the support we provide to those who would be diagnosed with level 3 autism that have higher support needs. So yeah, that's something I am very concerned about.
Why I'm asking is because my very close friend has a child who is, well, he's verbal, but he does require support for the rest of his life. And that's why I'm wondering
Yeah.
how much crossover there are actually in needs and approaches. Because it's one thing to listen to someone who is so barely, whose diagnosis is barely noticeable, like they said about my child. They said it actually required a proper testing to confirm it. And then there is a completely different story when you know that there is a child in your environment who will require help for the rest of his life. So how different are the approaches, or is it still the same diagnosis? And actually, in essence, in the deeper level, there is something of
I
this.
mean, there's going to be some overlaps, right? So like sensory, like you'll notice in the book, my whole first chapter is on sensory self-care, like addressing sensory needs of autistic people. That's going to be across the board, something that's important. Now, someone who's non-speaking, they might have more difficulty in communicating when I'm sensory overwhelmed, and they might show it through their actions, which often get misattributed, frankly, as aggression or other things. Um, so things like sensory needs, and some of those other nervous system based needs, those are going to have um, consistency across the board. I I like to talk about it as I'm still working on my language, but kind of like autism plus, in the sense of autism rarely walks alone. So whether we're talking about supporting someone with low support needs or high support needs, I think that's too like big of a construct. We need to talk about like, well, autism and what? Are we supporting autism and PTSD, autism and depression? Are we supporting autism and a co-occurring intellectual disability, autism and dyspraxia, which is difficulty with motor movement, autism and ARFID, which is difficult, like a more restricted, um, a lot of anxiety around foods. And so there's going to be different support needs, partly because what the autism is walking with is different. And that's going to flavor the experience of autism, because autism is intersecting with those other things, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much. I have to be mindful of the time, and we will have to be finishing in a few minutes. Thank you guys all for joining. I am really happy to see a lot of questions. Unfortunately, I will not be coming to your questions because I have a few more closing remarks and questions. So first of all, I want to, maybe it will be a little lighter note, but I want to start a new tradition, which we actually heard from one of our customers, suggested to have this one question that I ask of all my authors. I have two. And one of them is, how would you like your book to change the world?
That feels like such a big question. I, you know, I, autistic people were not given a manual of like, here's how your brain works, here's how your body works. So I hope that for autistic people, it can feel like a guide of like, hey, welcome to your nervous system, welcome to your system, welcome to your brain. Here's some ways to work with it. So that would be my hope for autistic people. I think for non-autistic people who read it, I hope it helps them understand the autistic people in their life. I hope it helps debunk some myths. Yeah, so I think that would be my answer.
Thank you. And I think it definitely helps to start the conversation, at least when it comes to Mindvalley. Actually, that's probably the first conversation we're having on this topic with you guys, and I'm really happy about that. Now, the second question is now completely new. So part of the reason why I do the book club is because I want to make reading fashionable again, partially because of the way we live in this fragmented environment where everything is bite-sized, very quick-paced, very superficial. Reading has such benefits for your for your cognitive abilities and for a lot of other things as well. So sorry for giving this long prequel. I probably won't be giving it in the future because it might taint your answer. But my new tradition is going to be ask all my guests, what does reading mean to you?
Oh my gosh, I love that question. And I actually really loved all the context leading up to it. I mean, reading has meant really different things for me. One thing I talk about a lot is I access my inner world through my mind. Because I because accessing it through my emotions is harder for me. So, um, I mean, reading has meant so many different things. It's meant escape at times. It's meant getting to access different cultures, different worlds. It's meant understanding the world, understanding my mind. It, I would call it anchoring and grounding in the sense that it helps me understand the world, and especially as an autistic person, um, that's been incredibly expansive and powerful for me.
Thank you so much. And the traditional request to my audience, please leave a heart for my guest in the chat or in the comments under the video when it's in the recording. And thank you so much, Megan Anna, Neff, Dr. Megan Anna Neff, for joining us this early in the morning and for sharing yourself so openly and so honestly. And I really appreciate this wonderful, warm conversation. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I've also really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining. And I'll see you again, not next week, actually in September. So a little break, but see you soon again. Bye.